Hi, my name is Keith Milner. I live in England near a place called Reading, which is about 30 miles to the west of London. As well as an interest in music and music production, I am also a fan and user of open source and Linux. I'm going to talk to you today about how to prepare the open source DAW application ARDA using the project checklist as a guide. Part of this includes setting up the environment known as Jack. In the Lesson 2 video lecture on project checklists, Loudon described 5 things to consider when setting up your DAW for a project. We will set up the ARDA DAW on a Linux environment using this checklist. Note that it is most natural in this case to approach these items in a different order than Loudon originally listed. Here is a quick overview of the system I am using. It is a standard desktop PC with an Intel processor. I have 12 gigs of RAM, but you don't need that much. For this assignment, I will be using the Roland VS20 audio interface, and I am running Linux Mint 13 as an operating system. I will be using the Jack connection kit, known as Jack, and version 3 of ARDA or ARDA 3. I will not be covering the installation or any other setup of Linux itself. It's assumed that you have a working Linux distro with a working audio card. At the end of this presentation, I will give some recommended Linux distributions for those interested in starting out with audio on Linux. Before we get going, it is worth saying something about Jack. Jack is a framework for professional audio applications which is very popular on Linux, but it is also available on Apple Mac. It provides virtual audio and MIDI connections so that you can connect the audio or MIDI output of one application into the audio or MIDI input of another application. For example, the audio output of a drum sequencer can be directly connected to the input of a track in Ardour. It also provides a central sync and tempo distribution capability so that all applications are in sync with each other. And it provides a central transport clock and coordination mechanism so that you can control the playback, rewind, etc. of multiple applications simultaneously. Before we can use Ardour, we need to start the Jack server, and so we need to set up Jack. Many of the parameters on our checklist are configured within Jack, so we can configure those items now. We will use an application called QJackCTL, which is in the software repositories of most Linux distros. It's a nice easy way to use Jack. The QJackCTL window has buttons to start and stop the Jack server, to view the log messages, to configure audio and MIDI connections between applications, to control the transport clock, and it has a status window which shows the state of the server, the transport clock and some other useful information. And of course it has a setup button. If we click up the setup button, we can configure the audio parameters. First, we need to make sure the driver is correct. On Linux systems, it's normal to use the ALSA system driver. It's normally the default on Jack as well. Here we can also select the interface we want to use. I want to use the audio interface called VS20. On Linux, the bit depth or word length is controlled by the driver in the ALSA subsystem, and Jack inherits this setting, so we can't configure it here. The ALSA configuration varies depending on audio interface and driver, so we're not going to cover that here. We can configure a sampling rate in Jack. It's currently 48,000. I'm going to set it to 44,100 because I know this interface supports that better. We can also set the buffer parameters here. I can set this to 1 to 8 frames per period, and it's currently set at 3 periods per buffer, which is good. That gives us a latency in a region of 8 to 9 milliseconds. As you can see, there's plenty of other parameters here which can be used to fine-tune the settings for Jack. You may need to adjust those depending on your audio interface. You can also, if you wish, store multiple configurations as a named preset and recall it later. However, in this case, we're just going to click OK, and that will save the settings as the defaults. We can now press the Start button to start up the Jack server, and the status will reflect the status of the server. So now we have configured the digital audio preferences, the hardware settings for the audio interface, and the buffer size. Next, we will configure the project name and location. First, we need to have somewhere sensible to store our projects. I've created a folder called Pre-Production in my folder called Music, which is in my Home folder. Currently it's empty. We started Jack earlier, so all we need to do now is start ARDA 3. When you start it up for the first time, it will ask you to create a new session. We create a new session. I'm going to call this ARDA 3 test. And say where you want to store it. I'm storing it in the pre-production folder, which I showed you earlier. So we click open and it will create the project. So ARDA is now running. You can see that the file format is currently WAV, but it's 32-bit float. We can change that by going into the session menu, selecting properties, and then here we have various settings that we can change. If we go to the media tab, we can see the sample format. We can change that to example 24-bit integer, and we can change this to broadcast wave. Close the box, and that is now all set up. So we have now given the project a proper name and put it into a sensible location, and set the recording file type. We are now ready to start recording. So that is how to prepare the ARDA DAW under Linux using the project checklist. I hope you enjoyed it, and if I have inspired you to consider using Linux for audio in the future, recommended Linux distros for audio are KX Studio and Ubuntu Studio.